Today's daf, Sunday's daf in the Second Sanhedrin is daf Mem Zayin. And we were in the middle of a discussion about whether the things we do for a mate, mainly the hesped, and we talked about kfura as well, whether it's for the benefit, the kavod of the dead person or the kavod of the surviving relatives, that they should get kavod, that they memorialize and properly honor, this person who died. So we tried to bring proofs. We didn't really have a great proof. Tashma, we're going to bring another proof from a pasuk in Tehillim, which says, Rashi goes through that. The pasuk is talking about who miyaleh bahar Hashem, right? Who will go up to the mountain of Hashem, the kikapayim. Then it continues and says, nivzeh be'einav nimas, which in the simplest term means someone who in his own eyes is not stuck up. He is mevazeh himself. He defiles himself, and he doesn't stand on ceremony, so to speak. That's a person who Hashem values. Says the Braita, what's that referring to? Chizkiyahu melech Yehuda. It's referring to Chizkiyahu, the great king of Yehuda. Shegirar atzmot aviv. His father Achaz was not a good king. His son Menashe was not a good king either. But when his father Achaz died, he dragged hhis bones on mitah shel chavalim, on a bed that was made out of rope, meaning that the bones would bounce around and break up, and it was a very big bizayon. So he treated his father without kavod for the purpose of achieving a kapara for his father, or at least showing that he didn't care, that if his father wasn't righteous, he didn't deserve the kavod. But if it's for imishum yakud dechayehu, and the whole point of treating a body well after it dies is because of the people alive. So why would he do that to do this? I understand if it's for the mate, he wanted to show that he's not giving kavod to this mate because he wasn't a tzaddik. But if it's Mishum Yakud Dechai, why would he then treat the mate inappropriately? My taima says, well, no, the reason would be because he wanted he wanted his father to have a kapara. His father was not a good person or not good enough, and he wanted to do something in his death to achieve some atonement. It says Mishum Kapara Davu Mashila Yakud Yisrael. But I don't get it. If the whole point of this kfura and the hesped is to give value to the people who are alive, and this was a king, right? So he belongs to all the people. How could he, in order to get a kapara for his father, take away from the kavod of Yisrael? Answers the Gemara, that's what they wanted. Yisrael gufayo nichalahu demachli yikarayu legabe. Yisrael would want that they would want their king, who they did love and wanted to honor, that he should have a kapara through them, basically. Okay, Tashma, we have another case. Again, it's very interesting because we bring all these cases, 6 lines from the top. Amar Lahem, if you recall, we had this story in Masechet Ketubot, that when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi died, which was obviously a tremendous tragedy in Klal Yisrael, he said to the people, Rashi points out, reminds us that Rabbi lived in Tzipori, but he was buried in Beit Shan. So the trip, it's not very far, Tzipori, Beit Shan, right? But I guess they weren't traveling.
I didn't know he was buried there.
Maria
was in Bet Shean when she went to seminary. Right after.
Sorry, not Beit Shan, Beit Sha'arim.
Oh, okay. I was like,
but I think it's in the same. It's not a Beit Shan, but Beit Sha'arim. Sorry, I don't exactly know where Beit Shan.
That I don't know where it is.
Not so far, but anyway, so they took his body from Tzipori to Beit Sha'arim, and Rebbe said, "Al tispeduni b'yarot." Don't stop and say haspedim for me in all the little villages. Here, yarot means a small, as opposed to the big towns. So now, why not? Because there aren't so many people, right? We don't want to stop. We don't want to do it. But if the whole reason to say a hesped is for the people, if there's 10 people and they want to say a hesped, let them say a hesped. Why is Rebbe saying it's not covered for me, that, you should stop every time 5 people get together? You should wait for the big gatherings. It was done for those people anyways. Answers the Gemara, no, because Kasavra L'Tyaku Be Yisrael Tfei, it's more covered for Yisrael if you have a big gathering, right? If you have a huge crowd that comes together to eulogize and to honor him. Okay, now we get to our Mishnah, which of course is where we started. By Tashma, the Mishnah said, Halino lichvodo. If you remember, you're not allowed to leave over a body overnight, but if you do it for the kavod of the person who died, of the niftar, for example, havilo arom b'tachichim, to bring a coffin, bring a clothing, then eino overlav, it's not a problem. Now, what do you mean halino lichvodo? You're implying that you're doing this for the kavod of the mate, right? Which tells you that everything we're doing is for the dead person. My lav lichvodo shel mate. Well, no, it's lichvodo shel chai. right? It's a bizayon for the family if the person's not buried properly, if they don't have the right clothing, or they don't have the right coffin, or the right ceremony. It says Gemara, but if that's the case, mishum kvodo shalchai mevit leila meit, if it's for the purpose of the people living, you're going to mevit. Rashi says is the Aramaic word for leave over. You're going to leave over the dead, the body. In says Gemara, that's correct, because ki amar Rachmana lo talin nivlato eitz, right? Remember, we the way we know that you have to bury them and bury them quickly is because it says don't leave them hanging up on the tree. Ki kavar tikbarenu. But dumya de talu de itle bizayon. All the Torah is saying is don't leave them hanging up where it's obviously a big bizayon for the body. But if you're leaving the body overnight because you're trying to get better, things to bury them in, that's not considered bizayon. Avahacha kimen deletle bizayon. You're not leaving the body out. You're not leaving it in public. You're not hanging it up. Lo, it would not be a problem to be malin the mate in order to get clothing, even if the purpose of the clothing was for the covet of the living people.
So what was the real purpose of hanging them? Is it for other people to see what has happened to them?
I mean, purpose is hard to answer, right? The Torah says to do it. So it's obviously there to show how severe the crime was, right? Yeah. And so people would say,
Okay.
it's something so wrong. But remember, as the Mishnah pointed out, it was very severe, but we don't want people talking about it too much, right? Because they don't want them to say that he was Mechalel Hashem or he was Mechalel Avodah Zarah.
Right, but if you hanging him, then they're definitely going to talk
They
about
do,
it.
but we leave him up for a short period of time. That's why we do it at the end of the day, as we said yesterday, and we leave it up for a very short period of time. But
Yeah.
it's because it's such a severe thing that we not only kill them, but you hang up the body so that everyone knows of this bad thing that happened.
Okay.
Tashma. Now there's a Braita, and this Braita adds on to our Mishnah, which says, Helino lichvodo. Let's say you leave over the body for its honor. For example, the Shamea Lavayarot, to spread the word, right? So people would know and can gather so that they can participate in the Kfura. Or Lavilo Mekonenot. Remember, they had to hire the Mekonenot, the ones who did Kinoi, the Echa people, who sang and did, and made the proper mood of tears and etc. Or Lavilo Aron B'Tachrichim, as we said earlier, Eino Vera Love. Because it's all only being done for the covenant of the mate. That sounds very clearly that you're doing it for the mate. This is why no, it's the same answer we've given 3 times already. Hachikamar. It means if you're doing it for the family or the living relatives or the living people, that's not considered to be a bizayon of the mate because there's a reason you're doing it. You're not doing it because you don't care. You're doing it for a reason. Tashma. Now Rabbi Natan says something very interesting. Siman yafa l'meit. It's a good sign for a person who dies. Shenifra'im mimenu lachar nita. If he gets punished after he dies. Now, how could a person get punished after they die? They're already dead. For example, says Rabbi Natan, meit shalon ispat. Let's say a person dies and they say no espedim because they couldn't get people together. It was a bad time. Whatever it was a terrible situation. They couldn't say a hesped or lo nikbar, or they couldn't bury the person. Right, for whatever reason, it was a war. It was. Then ochaya gorato, or an animal drags the body away and ruins it. Oshayu kishamim itself in mitato, or it was pouring rain, right? And the whole mita gets wet and everything gets ruined. In all of these things, that is a siman yafel mate. It's a good sign that Hashem basically is punishing the mate before they get to heaven or before they get to out of this world.
How do we look at it if actually he dies and it's on a chag or something where you're not supposed to do any hesped? Is it also considered that it's actually good for him?
Yes, so some people say that that's siman yafeh. It's not, it's not necessarily what it means here, but basically it's a kapara, and it means that you didn't have control, but it was organized in a way that Hashem wanted the person to have a kapara, and hopefully it saved them from whatever punishment they might have gotten. So Shema Mina, you see from here that Yikra Deshach Vihu, that really, Siman Yafel Meit, if the whole purpose of the Hesped is so that the family could be there, then why should it be a Siman Yafeh if it's raining and the family can't hear a Hesped, right? They're the ones who lose, not the mate. So it must be, as we assume, Yikra Deshach Vihu, that really it's done for the mate, it's done for the one who died. Shema Mina, that's in fact the priority. Continues the Gemara now at the 2 dots, almost halfway down near the end of the narrow lines. It says, Lo hayakovrino to. Remember that after they hung him up, they took him down. They didn't bury him with his family. They put him in a special cemetery for people who were killed by Beit Din. Ask the Mishnah why. Kol kach lama. Ask the Gemara, sorry. Lefishein kovrin rasha yitzal tzaddik. because he's a Rasha, he was killed for being Mechalel Shabbat or whatever his Avera was, and you don't bury him with the family, which are tzaddikim. Dam Rabbi Acha Bar Chanina, Minayin Shein Kovrim Rasha Yitzel Tzaddik, Shenemar, there's a very interesting story you have with Elisha. Well, Elisha was dead, but it was where after Elisha died, there was a man, it says, Vayim Kovrim Ish, they were burying a person. This person ended up being someone who was not a good person. He was the false Navi, etc. And they saw a military, a troop coming, so they had to run, and they just finished the funeral, right? They didn't have time to bury him properly. They threw the body into whatever the kever next door, which was the kever of Elisha. The person's touched, the dead corpse, touched Elisha or the bones of Elisha, and he came back to life. And he walked on his feet. So you see from there that this person was a Rasha, and it wasn't appropriate for him to be buried next to Elisha. So therefore, he came back to life, and I guess moved somewhere else, and then died again. Right? Says the Gemara. That's an interesting proof, but maybe there's a whole different reason for that story. Maybe Amarle of Papa Dilma Likiume. Maybe the whole reason that this person came back to life was to fulfill the prophecy that Elisha asked of Eliyahu when he said, "He na pishnayim ruchacha alai." I want to have double your power, right? So you, Eliyahu, brought one kid alive, and we know Elisha brought the child of Shunamit alive, but what's the second one? So maybe Elisha was not alive, but he had to bring someone else alive to fulfill the prophecy, not because there was a problem with that person being buried next to him. Amrle, so they said to Rav Papa, Ihachi, doesn't make any sense because this story, Hainu Titania, we learned in a Braita, Al Raglav Amad, which the pasuk says, he got on his feet, but it doesn't say Lebeito Loholach, he didn't go home, meaning he got on his feet, he walked 5 feet and out of the cave, and then he died again. So that's not exactly a very good example of Elisha bringing someone back to life. Anyone can bring someone back to life for 1 minute. I don't know anyone, but that's not exactly what it means. So says okay, so it's a good proof that you can't bury a tzaddik next to a Rasha. But when did Elisha bring a second person back to life? If that was the prophecy, the promise that he was going to get double Elio, what was his second miracle? Where do you find that he brought someone else back to life? Right? One of the other very famous stories of Elisha is that he healed Naaman from his fatal illness, basically his tzarat. Shishkula kamet. Remember when Miriam got tzarat, she said, "I'm like a dead person." So you see that healing a person is also like bringing them back to life. So that's a good message. But continues the Gemara. So that's Elisha. Ukeshem, where am I? The third wide line, right? Ukeshem she'en korvin rasha itzel tzaddik. Now, just like you can't bury a Rasha, this person was killed by Beit Din, next to a tzaddik, and therefore you have to bury him separately. Kach ein korvin rasha chamor itzel rasha kal. You can't bury a bad Rasha or a worse Rasha, and that's why we said there's 2 cemeteries. Wow. One for the more serious mitot Beit Din of Sreifa and Skila, and the other for Chenek and Eric. Says, well, why don't you have 4? Litkin Arba, right? Why don't you have Arba Kfarot? Says, well, you're right. We don't have a good answer for that. Shnei Kfarot, Gemara, Gamila. They had a tradition that there's 2 separate cemeteries, not 4 separate cemeteries. Amar Ula, Amar Yochanan. Now, it says the Gemara, and this seems like a very interesting non sequitur. Of course, we will see in a little bit how this relates to our Mishnah. Said Ula in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Let's say you have a person who's achal chelev, right? They eat fats from the animal, which is a lo taseh. Usually, if you do that, you have to bring a carbon chatat if it's by mistake, or you get makon. V'hifrish karban, he separates a carbon for his chatat. V'hemir dato, and then he goes off the derech. He becomes a mumar. He stops believing, and now you're not allowed to bring a carbon for someone who doesn't believe. So basically, he no longer is suitable to bring a carbon. But then chazarbo. But then he changes his mind. He goes back to the true belief. So says the Gemara, Ula, ho v'nidcha yidacha. Since he couldn't bring the animals a carbon when he was a mumar, the fact that he's not a mumar now, he can't bring this carbon. He's got to separate a new carbon for his chata. Itmar nami. In fact, we have another similar comment. Amar B'Yirmi, Amar Bavo, Amar B'Yochanan. Let's say a person achal chele v'hifrish carbon v'nishtateh. Then they lose their mind, right? They go insane, or that's shoteh. which is what we mean by it. So they suffer,
Okay.
a mental breakdown that makes them not competent or able to bring a carbon, right? We don't bring a carbon for someone who doesn't have mental capacity. So in that moment, they can't bring a carbon, and then they recover. The chazar v'nishtapen, and they get better. Says Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Yo, in the same name of Rabbi Yochanan, since at the time that this person was not suitable to bring a carbon, this carbon was no longer able to be brought as a carbon chatat, it is pushed off forever, and you have to bring a new animal for your carbon chatat. Says Gemara, these seems to be very overlapping halachot, right? Because they're both examples where a person separated a carbon, and then something changed, and then we say that, once it was pushed off, it's pushed off. Says Gemara, but you need to teach me in both cases, both the case where he had a, mental change, or at least they're both mental, but right, one where he had an intellectual change and he was mumar, and one where he had a medical change, we'll call it psychological change, and he became nishtateh. And why do you need both? If you said the first one about the mumar mishum nafshi, there he chose not to do it. So basically, by choosing to not believe, right, he basically canceled his carbon. This one, where he just became sick, basically, it happened passively. Maybe it's not so different than someone who's sleeping, right? Obviously, when you're sleeping, we allow you to bring a carbon, even though you're not awake, so you can have a messenger bring it for you, because it's considered, it's just part of life. You sleep. It's not something different. But if you only said the second one of the person who lost their mind, let's say, when, mishum de'em biyado lachzor, it's because it's not his control to change. You can't heal yourself, unfortunately, from mental illness, right? Or not always. Aval hatam de biyado lachzor, but if it has to do with your belief system and you change your mind, you decide you want to be a mummer, you can wake up tomorrow morning and say, I don't want to be a mummer anymore. So maybe you're always a little bit closer to still bringing the carbon, right? And therefore you need a halacha in both cases. Now, so far, it has nothing to do with our Mishnah. But says Rav Yosef, we have a Mishnah that actually supports this. A Braita, because the Braita is going to say later about Irani Dacha. So remember, one of the halachot of Irani Dachat is that most of the city committed idol worship. And so you basically kill all the people and you burn the city, the pasuk says, right? You gather all the shlala into the middle of the city and you burn it. And we had this earlier in the week, right? So the Braita says, Hayuba kachim, right? Let's say you had kachim mizbeach, right? Let's say in the city, there were karbanot, that people who unfortunately, initially brought, separated for a karban that's kache mizbeach. It's going to be a chata, right? Then yamutu, they die, because you can't bring them as a karban because the person's a mummer, right? They committed avodah zarah, and you can't redeem a carbon that's for the mizbeach. So you basically have to let it graze until it dies. You can't do anything with it. But if it's kache bedek habayit, if it was dedicated to the bedek habayit, then, like, let's say it's a animal damum, or it's an animal that's not appropriate, then yipadu. Then you can redeem the animal and the money, because it really belongs to bedek habayit. It doesn't belong to the person. But now we asked about this braita, amayamutu. Why do you say that the animal has to be killed if it was a karban chatat? Let's say, why don't you? Chatat's not a good example. Let's say it was a karban shlamim, right? Why do you have to kill the animal? Even iktal, since the owner was killed by Beit Din for his crime, havile kapara. Now he's forgiven, as we said in all these mishnayot. Midat Beit Din is a kapara. So this person committed avodah zarah, but then they were killed. So therefore they're basically absolved of their sin. And so why can't their animal now be brought as a karban? Because they're not a mumar anymore, right? Lab mishum darmina must be because we say that since in between the sin and the killing, yidachu, right? So you see clearly that this supports Rabbi Yochanan's rule, that although there was an interim time where you couldn't bring the carbon because he was basically a mummer at that point, even though he then got a kapara, you can't bring the carbon afterwards, after he dies. That's why chatas is not a good example, because chatat shemetu ba'aleh you wouldn't bring anyways. But a shlamim or an ola you could certainly bring after death, right? So that was what Rav Yosef said, right? Amarle Abaya said, Abaya, whoa, slow down. Ni savrit mate bitoch risho havle kapara. Who says that if a person dies doing their sin, meaning if a person doesn't do vidoy and do tshuva, they did a sin and then Beit Din kills them? Who said they automatically get absolved of the sin, right? Mate bitoch risho lo havle kapara. That's not a kapara. So just the fact that he was killed by Beit Din doesn't absolve him of his sin. The Tani of Shmaya, Yachla afilu pirshu avotav midarkei tzibor yitama. It's a whole nother halacha, right? A person, a Kohen, is not allowed to become tamei. But it says in the pasuk that he becomes tamei to his father or his mother. But says the Braita, or Reb Shemai, sorry, it's a Braita. It's actually not a Braita. You might think that Yachla afilu pirshu avotav midarkei tzibor yitama, that even if his father was separated from the tzibor and he wasn't, part of the Jewish tzibor, that the Kohen should be mitameh to his father, Talmud Omer bi'amav, right? That you're mitameh to your father if he's part of the nation, but osem maseh amav, right? And so what you see from there is, why don't you say, what do you mean his father might have been a Rasha, but if he dies, he's not a Rasha anymore, right? It must be that just dying does not absolve you of all your sins. You have to do tshuva as well. So it's no proof because maybe the people in the Arni Dacha didn't do tshuva. Amalei Rava said, Rava, that doesn't seem like a question at all. You're mixing apples and oranges here, right? In one case, his father just died. In the other case, he was killed by Beit Din. So it could be that if the guy just dies, it's not a kapara, but if Beit Din kills you, that might be a kapara, right? So I'll read that inside. It says Rava, 6 lines from the bottom, 7 lines. Mika medamit neharag mitoch risho lemeit mitoch risho. Being killed for your sin is very different than dying in your sin. Meit mitoch risho. You died a natural death like a normal people. So then nothing traumatic necessarily happened. It's not a kapara. But nereg mitoch if you're killed, that's a very big deal. And kivan de lo ki orche you didn't have a quote unquote natural death, right? You had a enforced death. Maybe habile kapara. Teda, and I can prove that to you. This because there's a drasha from a pasuk in Tehillim. It says mizmar la'asaf, right? When this is in the series of Mizmar L'Asaf. Elohim ba'u Elohim Mizmar L'Asaf Elohim ba'u goyim benachlatecha. The goyim came into your nachal, in your portion. Tim'u et heichal kachecha. They impurified your heichal. Natnu et nivlat avdecha. They gave the nivelot of your servants machalo of Hashemayim as food for the birds. And besar chasidecha, in the flesh of your chasidim, lechaito aretz, the animals of the land. So we ask about this pasuk, what's the difference between avadecha and chasidecha, right? These are two levels of God's people. Avadecha are servants, chasidecha sound like you're righteous, they sound very similar. So ask the drashot, my avadecha, my chasidecha, it must be the chasidecha are chasidecha mamash. Chasidecha are the truly righteous people who never left God, never, rejected anything. Unfortunately, they died in the Churban like everybody else, right? But their death and their animals, their bodies were mutilated. Avadecha are those who are hanu de mechayva dina. They are the people who were guilty. They did things wrong, right? So they're not chasidecha to make her they were chayev. V'kivan de ikdol, but since they were killed by Beit Din, or killed by not by Beit Din in this case, killed by the Romans, or not the Romans, but the Persians in this case, right? Killed in the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, karei avadecha. They're called avadecha because you see that basically death leads to a kapara. Amrle Abai said Abai again, you're comparing a whole wrong situation because you're caught Mika Medamid. Can you compare Harugei Malchut? Right? Someone who dies al Kiddush Hashem as a Harugei Malchut, everyone agrees, right? That no matter how not Hasidim they become Hashem's Avadecha, right? Because they're killed by the government, they're killed in some catastrophe or Holocaust. Everyone, and it's a fascinating halacha, right? That they are considered to be avadecha, even if they were not chasidecha, even if they weren't righteous, their death is a kapara for them. But that's not the same as being killed by Beit Din, right? Killed by Beit Din in a proper format where you had a court, you had a judgment, you had witnesses, you had a chance to defend yourself is very different, right?
So is that what would actually consider people who unfortunately died like in Nova? That it was a kapara for them?
I mean, this is again. I'm not. These are complicated things to talk about, of course. But that's what this pasuk is saying, right? That those who were killed, there's chasidecha and avadecha, right? And that the chasidecha are the ones. This drasha is that they're the ones who are truly God's chasidim from before their death, and the avadecha are the ones who were not chasidim before their death. They were guilty. They had done sins or whatever it was, but through their death of harugei malchut, which certainly that counts, right? They became avadecha. They're considered to be avadecha. So,
okay.
Anyways, again, very, very personal discussion, but clearly it's a different category. So harugei malchut, kivan deshelo bedin kamiktala, right? Harugei malchut are killed haphazardly. They're killed by some reckless tyrant or terrorist or whatever. So there, I understand haveli kapara. Their death is a kapara. That harugei beit din, but someone who's killed by beit din, sure, it's not a natural death, but it was done fairly, right? Given dibidin kamiktali, they were killed appropriately through the judgment of court. Lo haveli kapara, that is not necessarily a kapara unless they do tshuva, right? And teda, you know that it's not. Now we get to our Mishnah finally, right? So this is why we're bringing this whole thing. Because the Mishnah says in the fifth line, now, fifth line of today's of Amud Bet, Lo hayakovinoto b'kfurat avotav. You wouldn't bury this person with his father's family. Why not? If the automatic death through Beit Din gives you a kapara, so now you're not a Russia anymore, right? We said we don't bury a Russian next to a tzaddik, but you're not a Russia anymore. Likbru, so likbru, you should bury them with their family. Answers the Gemara 1 second. It's true. That's not a proof at all. Because it could very well be that the mitah of Beit Din is a kapara. But the mitah is not enough. You need to be killed and buried. Because remember, we talked about yesterday, right? Burying a person, putting them under the ground is a bizayon and a statement to what it means to be, to be human. So maybe mitah ukfura be'inan. What you really need for a kapara is them dying and being buried. It's only after they're buried that you could actually say they had a kapara, right? Which goes along with the end of the Mishnah, which said that then you can move their bones over time, right? So continue, but before we get to that point, Motiv Ravada Barava, asked Ravada Barava, what about the next part of the Mishnah, which said, Lo hayum mit ablin, they didn't do any public avelut for this person, because presumably they're a Russia, El onanim, you could do aninut shein aninut el belev, because it's internal. If you say that once you bury the person, it's a kapara, right? So now they're not a Rush anymore. So why don't you have a regular shiva, right? La'ablu, why don't you mourn them? Answers the Gemara, Be'ina nami ikul basar. You need the flesh to be decomposed, is what we translated yesterday, right? So meaning that whole, it's obviously, there's levels and levels of
there's a process
and death, but it's not just dying that's a kapara. It's dying, being buried underground, having your flesh rot away. That process is a kapara. And Dekanami, Diktani, because the Mishnah actually says, Nitakel Basar, once the person's flesh is decomposed, then you actually take the bones and put them back. Because at that point, they're not a Rush anymore, and you can bury them with their family.
So they had to have known how long it took to do that. They're not going to go and check every 5 minutes if it's happened.
They had to have known. I imagine it varied tremendously, right, based on
the weather
circumstances, right? Where you bury them, how deep, how cold, how dry, time of year. I'm sure in the summer, whatever,
Yeah.
I don't know that much about the details, but I imagine it's much more faster to decompose, right? So, but obviously, there's cases like they very dry places in the desert, right? You bury people and they can stay for a very long time, right? So
right.
Correct. They had to have known. I assume that they had this. Now, it says the Mishnah, while we're sort of on the topic of I don't know how, in Sanhedrin, we don't really have any problems moving off topic. Didn't bother anybody.
That's what it looked like.
Rav Ashi says, Avelut me'ematai komatchalet. When do you, Rav Ashi's answering the question, right? When do you start Avelut? Avelut starts mistimat hagolel, when you cover the coffin, right? There's a machlok of Rashi and Tosfot all over the place. Interesting, Rashi here does not say anything as far as I recall. But Tosfos does, and he quotes Rashi, don't worry. Rashi always seems to imply that the golel is the stone or the cover of the coffin, basically. Tosfos really doesn't like that. He hates that pshat. So he understands that it means that they would put the body in the ground, maybe with the coffin, but then they would put a big stone, or it doesn't have to be a stone, it could be a big marker on top of where the body's buried up to the ground so you know where it is. So it's not actually the cover of the grave, it's sort of what we would call the stone, right? The
tombstone.
Yeah, the tombstone. So which matters a lot more, because we're always talks about jumping on these tombstones, and he's very bothered why a person's not tameh if it's really the top of the coffin, which would be tameh. So anyways, but that is the period, says the Rav Ashi, that you don't start avelut until you close the golal. And the kapara me'ematai kahavi michichaz tzara dikivra porta. You don't get a kapara until you have some of the pain of being buried, meaning sitting there, again, the person is dead, but sitting there alone in the ground, etc. So therefore, because at the moment that you close the grave and Avelut starts, he hasn't gotten a kapara yet, you don't start Avelut. And Hilkach, and this is where we could get all the way full circle to what we started with, Hoel, the Idchu, Yidchu. Since you pushed off the Avelut, you never do it, right? So it's the same message that we had earlier from Rabbi Yochanan, that because at the moment that Avelut's supposed to start, you can't start it because the person has not had a kapara yet. You never have Avelut for that person. Says the Gemara, well, if that's true, Ravashi, why do you have to wait till the body decomposes? Wait a week and then move the body, right? Why do you have to wait till there's nothing there? Yachi lamali ikul basar. Why don't you, if you say that the kapara happens once they've been in the grave for a little bit, wait a week or a month or whatever, and then move it? Says Gemara, it's you could, but it's not practical, right? Because you obviously don't want to move a body that's partly decomposed, right? Once you leave it there, you want to wait till it's bones, and that's obviously much more practical to move. Mishum delo efshar, it's not possible. Now, while we're talking about graves, an interesting story, Kivrei de Rav, where Rav died, I don't know exactly where Rav was buried, but we're on top of the grave of Rav, I guess it was in Bavel, but I don't know if we know where. I don't recall if the Gemara talks about it. But in the grave of Rav, which obviously was known to the people, and they all went there on pilgrimage, right? Havishakli mine afra, people would gather some dirt from the grave, liishta bat yuma, for a 1 day fever, meaning like a very acute, sudden fever. So if you had very high temperature, you would go and gather some dirt from the grave and maybe put in your water and your tea and you'd drink it. Okay? So Atu Amrulay the Shmuel, they told Shmuel about this. Remember, Shmuel took over after Rav died. So they came and told Shmuel, everyone's going to pilgrimage to Rav's grave and taking the dirt and putting in their tea. Amrulay said, it's not a problem. I don't, they were bothered that it seems like it's Asr Bahana or whatever. He said, Ye'udavdin, it's fine what they're doing. I'm not sure if he endorsed it, but he said it's fine what they're doing because Karka Olamhu, because it's just dirt. The Karka Olam Eno Neseret, and dirt does not become Asr. Tichtiv, as it says, the Yashlech et Afra el Kever b'nei Ama'am. This is talking about Yoshio when he burned down the Asherah and he took the dust and the ashes and he sprinkled it on the graves. So you see that the ashes were comparing the dust of the Asherah tree, which is Avodah Zarah, to the graves. Makish kever b'nei am la'avodat kochavim. We're comparing a cemetery to Avodah Zarah. Ma'avodat kochavim b'mechubar lo mitzra. Just like Avodah Zarah is not prohibited if it's attached to the ground. Dichtivas, we have a very, very famous statement we've had many times. Asher atem yoshim otamet Eloheiam al harim haramim. Right, that their gods, their Avodah Zarah is on the high mountains, which means Al Haharim Elohim, their gods are on the mountains, below Haharim Elohim, but the mountains can't be their gods. So if they worship, a mountain, it doesn't make a mountain usher because you can't be prohibited something that's attached. And if people go and say we worship, I don't know, the Mississippi River is our idol, it doesn't make the Mississippi River an Avodah Zarah. It has to be something on the mountain, not the actual natural phenomena.
But
So
don't we say that actually trees would actually qualify as Avodah Zarah?
these are different. I'd say Asherah are different. Yeah, you could prohibit trees for Asherah.
Because it's actually grounded, so it's
It's
part of.
grounded, but because you could plant them for that. So I think it means more like stones and
Okay.
mountains, literally, but earth basically.
Yeah.
So it says the Gemara, Hachinami b'mechubar lo mitzar. Same thing is true by graves. That we compare a grave that what's attached to the ground, meaning just by burying a person there, you can't make all the ground around that part of the grave and prohibit it. Mates, I asked the Gemara, we got a series of questions on this, which will take us through the end of today's daf. There's a bright that we're going to have later, which says the following. Hachotzev kever la'aviv. A person digs a grave for his father. The halach v'kavro b'makom acher, but then he goes and takes his father and buries him in another place. Says the bright Reza Elo Yikaver Bo Olamit. You can never use this grave again. So
For anyone.
For anyone. It's prohibited. Why? Why don't you say it's ground? Ground doesn't become prohibited, right? And we didn't use it. It says it's not talking about ground, it's talking about where you made a mausoleum, right? So you built something for the person's father. So it was built and dedicated for that. You can never use it for anything else. Tashma, then we have another Braita, which we're going to quote later, that says the following thing. You have
I found out when he died, where he's buried.
Where's Rav buried?
He's buried in Kafrei.
Kafri. Okay, that's true.
You know where that is?
No, but it's somewhere in Bavel. But it does talk about where they went. I think there is a story about traveling to his grave. Okay, more to come. Tashma, though, let's continue. We're 2/3 of the way down. First word on a line. We have a brighta. Tashma kever chadash. Let's say you have a new grave. Now, a new grave means, right, that you built a grave, you dug a grave, we think it means, and no one has been put in it yet. So says the brighta, mutar bahana. You can use that grave if you want to play hide and go seek or whatever. You can, that grave, you're allowed to. But hitil bonefel, if you put a fetus, right, a stillborn child in that grave, asur bahana. Why is it asur bahana? Right? Why don't you say it's dirt? The dirt's never asur bahana. Hachanami bekever binyan. You'd have to give the same answer. We're talking not about dirt, but about where you created something. You made a house. Tashma, okay, another brighta which says Tash nimsa. This is a Tosefta in Olot. It says Ata Omer Shalosh Kfarotim. There's three categories of graves. There's kever hanimsa, a kever that is found, meaning that you basically stumble upon a grave that had no permission to be in your field. You own a field, you never told someone they can bury someone there. You walk in one day after 10 years, you're away, and there's a body buried there. Then there's kever yadua, which is a known permission grave, right? And kever hamaziket rabim. The third category is a kever that causes a public nuisance because it's in the road, Kohanim can't get past, you can't drive by, whatever the reason might be. So says the bright to the following. Kever nimsa, kever that is found, meaning it was done without permission, mutar lifnoto. You're allowed to move that kever because, a person buried, whatever that happened, they died in your field. It doesn't mean you have to now make your field into a cemetery.
Yeah,
right?
You don't have to keep it there.
You're allowed to move it. And Pinot, once you move it, mekomot tahar, the place is tahar, mutar bahana.
Oh, interesting.
But
if you find like a grave in the middle of your field coming back after a year, you don't know how long it's been there. It could have been there for like the past 2 days.
Right, but whatever it is, it was done without permission, so they don't acquire.
Right. But what I'm saying is like you can't necessarily move it right away.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
That's what I meant.
Logistics, yeah. Okay. But we're going to see in a second, if you recall, we've talked before about a mate mitzvah. That the exception to this is that a person who's a mate mitzvah dies, no one tend to them.
Yeah.
Then we say konem mikomo. They get the spot they died in, basically. So that's an exception. If a person does die in someone else's field and they're a mate mitzvah, they are buried there and you can't move them. So we'll ask in the second, how do you know this is not a mate mitzvah, right? But that's one category. The second category is kever hayadua, a grave that was known. It was built there. It was put there with permission. And if you change your mind and all of a sudden, now your field is prime real estate, you can't move it, right? Asur lifnoto, and this has consumed Israel for many decades, right? You can't clear it out. And Pinot, if you do clear it out, mikomo tameh, the place becomes tameh, it remains tameh, and asur bahana, which we're going to ask in a second. Why is it asur bahana? Even if there's a body there, it should be asur bahana. So we'll see. And the third category is kever hamaziket rabim, which is a kever that was done with permission, but you want to build a highway or a light rail, or this obviously these are all the discussions. There says the Mishnah, the Braita, mutar lifnoto. You're allowed to move it. Pinot, if you move it, mekomot tahor, vasur bahana, but it's asur bahana. So why is it asur bahana? Answers the Gemara. All of these cases have to be you didn't find a body in the ground. It's where you came back to your field and there was a built-up cemetery, a mausoleum. Hachanami bekever binyan. Ask the Gemara now the question, the kever hanimsa mutar lifnoto. We said that if you just show up and there's a person buried in your field, you weren't there for 20 years, they had no permission, you're allowed to move it, but Dilma made mitzvah. Maybe it was a person who died without any relatives, without anyone to bury them. And the halacha is mate mitzvah konem mikomo, that a person who's a mate mitzvah does acquire the place where they die. Says Gemara, it's true, but a mate mitzvah is very unusual, and there's always a big talk about it, and you would know that, right? Shani mate mitzvah, dekala, it's like, we assume everybody knows about a mate mitzvah, and therefore, since no one shows up and says, oh, this happened 3 years ago, and there was a story, we assume that that's not the case. Itmar, okay, let's continue with the Braita, which says, or Gemara statement, ha'oreg beged lamate. This gets into a very interesting machloket, which I think will continue tomorrow for quite some time, between Abaya and Rava, really quite some time, about whether the terminology is whether hazmana miltahi, whether preparing something, designating something for a purpose is a milta, is it effective in any way? Abaya says yes, Rava says no, meaning let's say we'll have a case tomorrow, it's an easier case. You say, I'm going to use this cloth to cover my Sefer Torah, right? And then, you change your mind. You decide you want to wear it as a coat, kind of thing, right? Does that limit you from being able to do that? So Abaye says yes, Rava says no. So let's continue. Let's see how this is relevant. So it says the statement, Ha'oreg beged lamate. You weave a beged tachmichem for a dead person, right? So and presumably it's for a specific dead person, not for a dead person, but for a specific person. Abaya says, well, even if you don't end up using it for that person, it's asur because it was made for the dead person. Rav Amar Mutar. Abaya Amar Asur Hazmana Milti. Preparing something for a purpose it counts, is a effective thing. And Rava says Mutar, and that's how we paskin. Hazmana Lav Milti. Now, my time in Abaya, what's the rationale? So there are, I'll give you the outline for a second. There are two cases which we can compare a kfura to. One is avodah zarah, and the other is eglah rufa. And the reason is because it says the word sham by all of three of these things, right? It says kavru sham, and they bring there the eglah rufa, and we'll see the word by avodah zarah in a second. We know the halacha is, we know this from elsewhere, that by eglah rufa, right?
Yeah.
The eglah rufa is brought, they find the body, they don't know who's responsible, so the Beit Din has to go out, they bring an eglah, they bring a calf, and they break its neck in the nachal, right? So if you go down to the nachal with an eglah and then you don't end up going through with the ceremony, or the cow runs away, let's say, that animal's usser, even if it wasn't had its neck broken. Just bringing it down makes it
You'd have
prohibited.
to be recognizing it again
Yeah,
to be
whatever the
able to
case.
say this guy was like
Or
running
no, or
away.
if they resolved it, right? Let's say they had new evidence, like, oh, it's closer to this city, or we know the
Yeah, yeah,
person.
yeah.
So the eglah that we learned that our fusham, that it's usher once you go down there to the nachal, right? By avodah zarah, we know for a fact from other sources that it's not the same. That if you designate a building and say this is going to be the new building for the avodah zarah, and you never use it for avodah zarah, it's not prohibited. So by avodah zarah, hazmana is not a problem. By eglah rufa, it is. The question is, what do you compare a mate to? Which one do you compare it to? So let's read that all inside now. My time in Abaya, Gomar Sham Sham Egla Rufa. He learns out, it says the Kavar Sham, and it says, you bring it down by Egla Rufa. My Egla Rufa Bahazmana Mitzra. Just like by Egla Rufa, it's a fact that just bringing the animal down without even breaking its neck, it becomes usher. Hainami Bahazmana Mitzra. Here too, by a dead person. Everyone agrees that if you bury a person in clothing, that clothing becomes prohibited. But if you prepare the clothing for that person, it also becomes prohibited. The Rava says, Gamar Sham Shami Avodat Kochavim. In fact, I learned from Avodat Kochavim. Ma Avodat Kochavim Hazmana Lo Mitzra. It's not prohibited by just designating a house or a clothing or an animal for Avodah Zarah until you worship it. Avhacha Nami Hazmana Lo Mitzra. So why compare it to one or the other? Rava, my time in Lagomer Egla Rufa. Why didn't Rava learn that it's similar? Again, the word sham sham is there in all three cases. So why didn't Rava learn it from Egla Rufa? Because Rava would tell you the top words on Daf Mem Ched Amid Aleph that look, when you think about these three things, right? The Avodah Zarah, you're doing something to help the Avodah Zarah. You're bringing an animal or a building. By the mate, you're doing the same thing. You're doing clothing for the mate. By the Egla Rufa, it's the actual animal that you're bringing down, right? So it's not something for the animal. It's the actual thing. And so therefore, it's one step removed by a mate and by Avodah Zarah. So mishamshin gamiran. We learn a support for the dead person or support for Avodah Zarah each from each other. Lafuke egla rufa dihi gufa kedusha. The egla rufa itself is the thing that's brought as a carbon, not as a carbon, but brought as an animal to become asur. That's Rava's statement.
Zach, finish your thought and
No, that's Rava. What's the question?
no, I was going to say I thought that like when something is mentioned three times that actually you could not like get any information out of it, that you shouldn't follow it.
You
What
mean a
did we see
prohibition?
last week?
You mean like miyut achar miyut kind of question?
No, 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 no.
But just to be clear, it's not mentioned three times, right? The word sham is there three times, but and the halacha by Avodah Zarah is clear. Again, you take my word for that, but that's the fact.
Yeah.
The halacha by Egla Rufa is clear. The one that's unknown is mate, and Rava says, let's compare a mate to Avodah Zarah, which is not prohibited with hazmanah. Abaya says, now on the second line, Abaya, my time in the Gomamri Avodat Kochavim. Why does Abaya say, I learned it out from Egla Rufa and not from Avodat Kochavim? Amar Lecha, because he would say, look, think about it. Egla Rufa is a normal thing that happens, right? Meaning if a person is found dead, they bring an Egla Rufa. A dead person is a normal thing that happens, right? People die all the time. But avodah zarah is not a normal thing. It's an avera, right? And so you should compare the sort of the normal things from the normal things, not the abnormal thing. So read that inside. Abaya says, "My time I tells you the third line. Midi de urche gamrina. We learn one thing that's a normal pattern, right? You're supposed to do it if you need to, from something you're supposed to do. Avodah kochavim is not something you're supposed to do, obviously, and
No.
therefore it's its own category. But there are other things. If you prepare, you prohibit it, and that's the machloket Abai and Rava. It's obviously has huge implications in practice, but we will have another Amud trying to figure out where we paskin and going through all those details. So that's where we end. Shakoach.
Thank you.
And we will meet again. Well, tomorrow morning, David will meet, but I will see you.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, so I wrote down like on Friday, I said if the Torah teaches the same thing twice, then
right,
that's
that's
fine.
miyud achar miyud, right?
But Tosafot says that if it actually shows up 3 times, then you don't learn from it for something from somewhere from anywhere else.
Right. So that's the idea of miyud achar miyud, meaning the Torah says don't do this, right? You don't do it. If it says don't do it twice, basically, then you do it. But if
Right.
it says don't do it 3 times, then you're sort of stuck.
Okay.
I think this is a little bit different. This is what do you compare to the other?
Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
Of course. Okay, Shavua Tov, Miriam.
Shavuot Tov. Thank you, Ellie.
You're welcome. Good night.